Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And we see many folks who are just waiting in the wings, waiting for us to open this. So we're a little bit early, just wanted to get you situated and get comfortable in your seats. We've got a very dynamic speaker presenting for you today. So we certainly appreciate your being on to join us. So thank you so much. Give us a quick moment and we will get situated here. Um, you know where the Q&A section is and the chat, so feel free to share and let us know who's in the room so our presenters will know that you're in as well. Thank you so much. So just wanted to point out, we do have our chat available, and during the session, please feel free to either post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. There will be a time designated for Kalei, who will be the first speaker to review your questions. So post those and keep that in mind, or else you can start putting them, queuing them in the Q&A, and we'll be able to go down the line to respond to those questions during the question and answer section of our session. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. This is the 2021 No More webinar series on identification and response to human trafficking in multidisciplinary settings. So just wanted to give a few more moments for folks to get settled in and log in. I know we've had some questions or emails saying you didn't receive the Zoom link. For future too, we realize and recognize that oftentimes your server may see it as junk mail, so that would be another place to check it out. And if it continues to be an issue, after you let us know and we try to send you the link, then let us know and we'll try to get you in another way. Also, if you know of anyone who's trying to connect after 8 o'clock this morning, for those lucky few who did register this morning, we were able to get you in. But if anyone is interested in joining us after we've started, please contact the office so that we can provide you with a link to be able to get on for today's session. So thank you all for participating and joining us in this session. And before we get started, just want to say thanks to our caption folks from Aberdeen Broadcast Services for being able to accommodate us in their busy schedule with our webinar today. And we also have Kanai, Ka- uh, Kanai. Oh my gosh. It's Nathan with our office, who's our ASL interpreter joining us. Sorry, with Kalei being on, I almost forgot how to say your name, Kanai. So here we go. Just wanted to get situated here. I'm Cynthia Cabot with the Guam Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence. Just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. Uh, this is day one. Our part two, which is day two, and day three will not occur until May 19 and 20. So if anyone is interested in signing up for those, we will certainly keep the registration open and you'll be able to join us then. But before we start, we just wanted to point out that if not for funding support from the Office on Violence Against Women, as well as Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, we would not have been able to provide this. And also in collaboration with the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center for being able to work with us to have our wonderful presenters and panelists for this webinar series. So our key presenters today will be Kalei Grant as well as Alani Bankhead, and you'll be seeing Kalei the first half of the session. Just wanted to give you a brief on the agenda. The times are going to be pretty much based on how we move along with the presentation. So this is pretty much more like placeholders where the break is. But just to give you an idea, we'll be covering human trafficking factors that contribute to trafficking of indigenous populations, then review differences between human trafficking and domestic violence and sexual assault, and then looking at addressing needs of trafficked individuals and coordinating services. And of course, this is just part one of our two-part series. As a reminder, for those of you who are frequent webinar groupies with the coalition, you know to go and visit www.guamcoalition.org. Click on the blue login button, and this time the username is Trafficking, and the password is capital H, capital T, 2021. For the password, it is case sensitive, so it's capital H and T. So you'll be able to download information such as the agenda, such as the presenter's bios that we have, and also the PowerPoint that we'll be able to share with you. Now, for this series, we are able and fortunate to be able to offer continuing legal education, or CLEs. So if you participate in all three CLEs, if you participate in all three webinar sessions, you'll be eligible for 3 CLEs, and that's a total of 7.5 contact hours. We will have additional information on that as soon as we obtain that on how you can receive more, but it will also be posted on the login site. But for additional information then on that, please email info@guamcoalition.org. So we just want to say too and call out May 19 and May 20 are our next round. And this is to give you a preview of what's in store for day two for our next webinar. So just want to remind you, registration is still open. So for those who have not yet registered, you're probably not on the webinar or on the call right now, but let others know the registration site is still open and we'll be able to accept more attendees for the May 19th and May 20th session. And that's the link, the SurveyMonkey link to be able to register. If you need more information or you forget the link, it's going to be noted in the chat throughout the session, as well as on our website. Your feedback is very important to us. So we just want to remind you to please complete the evaluation. You'll be receiving a Zoom-generated email saying, please complete the evaluation after the session is over, and it will direct you to the site. If you need to access it after that site and did not receive the info on it, please email us and we'll be able to send you that link. And we'll also be able to post that as well on the website. So for Zoom check-in, this is a Zoom webinar format as opposed to Zoom meeting. So if you're not familiar with that, automatically your microphones are muted and your cameras are off. Please comment using the Q&A or the chat. And for our panelists today, they have requested a certain time during their presentation that they've allotted for any questions. So post that and we will get to them as time is allotted. So thank you so much for being a part of this, and just wanted to get situated here and have our participant, our panelist, cue her materials online as I introduce her. So our first presenter, our panelist this morning is Kaleilani. We call her Kale Grant. She's the Assistant Coordinator for the Department of the Attorney General, Missing Child Center in Hawaii, and she assists law enforcement in recovering missing and exploited children. For over a decade, Ms. Grant has contributed her expertise by working with government and non-government agencies to strengthen systems response and combat human trafficking. Kale has shared this knowledge on various platforms, ranging from the Department of Education superintendents, town hall community boards, State of Hawaii's Supreme Court justices to the U.S. Department of Defense, combating trafficking in persons. As a native Hawaiian and survivor of sex trafficking, Ms. Grant believes in ho'omau, the native Hawaiian value of perseverance and persistence, the value pushing you to continue to fulfill your purpose, to persevere in your efforts by renewing those efforts, and to perpetuate those that work well. She feels that anything worth having is worth working for. A life of freedom is worth it. So on that note, just want to welcome Kale as our panelist this morning, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you. Aloha. Thank you, Cynthia, so much. Thank you, everyone, for attending today and joining us. We do have about 2.5 hours today, but we have a special guest that I'll introduce later that I'm sure you'll receive a lot of knowledge from. So we'll get right in there. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that introduction. Let me share my screen. If at any time you cannot hear me, please just chat it in the box. And also, as Cynthia mentioned, you can chat your questions or put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll go ahead and address it after each section. So again, thank you, everyone. So we will be going over human trafficking today. And I am here in Hawaii. So today for me, it is the 14th at about 1 p.m. So today, this is what we're going to be talking about. These are some objectives, some learning objectives that I hope you'll be able to learn after my presentation today. So the first 2 points is what I'll be doing first. The first is I'm going to be sharing with you what human trafficking is, giving you an understanding of what factors contribute to trafficking of indigenous populations, which is what both you and I share. And number 2 is I'm going to be talking about identifying key differences between human trafficking, domestic, and sexual violence. And then our special guest, Special Agent Alani Bankhead, will be joining us to provide more of the law enforcement perspective about combating this epidemic and sharing with you what we are doing here in the state of Hawaii and beyond to combat this, this crime. And then the last, I'll close off and share with you to identify, screen for, assess the needs of individuals who are at risk of trafficking or who have experienced sex trafficking. All right, so first, I'm just going to, this is really just to gauge our audience today. So we're going to review 2 case studies. And if I really love involvement. So if you're engaged, which I hope you are, if you can go ahead and chat in our box there, in our chat, and just add in your comments at any time. Just get the conversation going. So I'm going to be throwing questions out there throughout the presentation, and I ask you just chat and make comments in the chat box. So our first case study, these are some facts, and this is really just to help you become aware of how you might identify trafficking. So we're going to take a look at real life case studies. The first is an adult woman of Native Hawaiian descent met a man in a nightclub. Within the first 2 weeks of getting to know her, he portrayed to be someone he was not and learned everything he needed to use against her. He threatened to kill her and her family if she did not meet daily financial quota in exchange for commercial sex acts. 2 weeks turned into 2 years of violence, physical, mental, and emotional abuse, sexual assault, and rape. So question, is this trafficking? Go ahead and put your answer in the chat. Remember, there's no right or wrong answer. This is really a learning session, and I just want to engage you so that we can learn together. So go ahead, I kind of want to look at your answers there. Yes or no, is this trafficking? Yes, yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. All right, so this was an easy one. So the answer is yes, absolutely. And so what are the elements that make it trafficking? If anyone knows or can think of what that could be, go ahead and include that in the chat box as well. But the elements that we're looking at regarding this case is first, it's fraud. And fraud always includes a false statement, misrepresentation, or deceitful conduct. The purpose is to gain something of value, usually money, and it's through misleading or deceiving someone into believing something that the perpetrator knows to be false. So what's another element? The second is coercion, the use of intimidation or threats, force, or to prevent someone from doing something that they have the legal right to do or not do. And there's a third element. You got it right, John. The third element is force, power, violence, compulsion, or constraint exerted upon or against a person or a thing. So for this case, yes, it is trafficking, and all 3 elements is what made it trafficking. And a fun fact, this is a true story, and this is a quick synopsis of my own personal story. As Cynthia shared, I am a survivor advocate in this field, now professionally working with the government at the State Attorney General's office. So there is hope. Our training today, it's a lot of heavy information, and for some of us, it's a lot to digest. But I want you to know there's hope, and that's the most important thing. All right, case number 2. We're going to do this again. So go ahead and answer yes or no if this is trafficking. Keoki, an adult male who is Native Hawaiian, he also met a man in a nightclub. The man said he could get Keoki a job in Guam, making a lot of money in a club at a resort. When Keoki made it to Guam, he was told he would be working in construction, building military housing. Keoki was told that because of COVID, he was not allowed to leave the construction site, nor talk to anyone beyond the construction workers. Keoki was told if he left the site, he would not be able to come back and would not get a ticket to Hawaii, which would leave him stranded. So yes or no, is this trafficking? These are easy ones today. Yes, absolutely. So what are the elements? For this one, we're going to have the similar elements, two for sure, which is fraud and coercion. And so that was just really basic knowledge. I just wanted to run that by you just to kind of see your knowledge right now in the audience. So let's move on. So what do we mean by human trafficking? Well, according to the TVPA, which is Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, it may sound familiar to some of you. Human trafficking is a crime involving the exploitation of someone for the purpose of compelled labor or a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And according to the federal law, a commercial sex act means any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. So anything of value could include food, shelter, protection, gifts, or clothing. Protection is a key one. If you hear anyone say, that's my security guard, or I need security, that's what protection refers to. And also, where a person younger than the age of 18 is induced to perform commercial sex acts, it is a crime regardless of whether there is force, fraud, or coercion. So terminology, throughout this training, we'll use several terms that seem interchangeable, but they are not. When we refer to a participant, patient, or client, we're speaking about an individual you encounter in a professional capacity who may or may not be involved in human trafficking. A victim, as we will refer here, is an individual who has experienced trafficking. The term victim is used when referencing laws or statutes that provide protections or resources that a victim is legally mandated to receive. Survivor. Survivors of trafficking are individuals who are working toward healing in the aftermath of the trauma of experiencing trafficking. How many of you know that healing is a process? It takes time. It can often range. Survivors may go through different stages of healing, and multiple times. Survivors are not defined by victimization, while human trafficking may be one experience in a survivor's life. It is definitely not our full story. So many survivors many survivors use our lived experiences to help others by working as professionals in the anti-trafficking field. The traffickers can be an individual. It can be part of a network. They exploit others for the profit gained from forced labor and commercial sex. So the terms indigenous community and indigenous population is we will be using throughout this presentation. They are used interchangeably. Many may refer to American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, which I represent, or Pacific Islander populations. So indigenous communities and indigenous populations are not only tribal jurisdictions, enrolled members of tribes or on reservations, but they also include indigenous individuals living in urban, suburban, and rural settings off reservations. So professionals working with individuals exiting trafficking situations or working with colleagues who have lived experience, they have a unique role in providing a non-judgmental space for individuals. So when we when we work with those that have lived or are living a life of trafficking, they never want to feel judged. Um, and some may choose to self-identify with terminology that is most empowering to them. So healing looks different for every person, and identifying as a survivor is a choice. Some individuals with lived experiences might choose to identify as a victim even after a trafficking situation. Some might choose to identify as a survivor while currently in a situation of exploitation, while others might identify with none of these terms. So it looks different for different people. So it may sound complex, and it is, but I promise that you're going to hopefully get the gist of this. So providing alternative language is really important. It's an important key component of trauma-informed and empowerment-based care, which, as Cynthia mentioned earlier, I'll be coming back in May to focus more on trauma-informed care, which we'll be able to discuss further. So there are two different types of trafficking, of human trafficking that we'll talk about today. Human trafficking occurs when a trafficker exploits a vulnerable person, as I mentioned, using force, fraud, or coercion, just as we reviewed in the case studies. They make them perform compelled labor or commercial sex or commercial sex. So a report from the Polaris Project, the typology of modern slavery, further breaks down instances of labor and sex trafficking into 25 distinct categories. They detail the unique trafficker profile, recruitment tactics, victim profile, and method of control for each subset of modern slavery. Severe forms of trafficking is defined as recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, in which commercial sex is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, so against their will. And of course, as mentioned earlier, for those younger than the age of 18, in the TVPA, the term commercial sex act means any sex act on account of which anything of value is given or received by any person. So sex trafficking, it can be facilitated by family members. It occurs in homes, it occurs online, which Alani will cover and go into a little later. It occurs on the street. It occurs in commercial locations. In homes, individuals may be compelled to engage in sex acts in exchange for the provision of basic needs, such as shelter, food, clothing, money, or anything of value. Alcohol, drugs. Drug addiction is a huge element in this. And the list goes on and on. So, but it is anything in exchange for the provision of basic needs. So this places them at a further risk of exploitation, particularly sex trafficking, especially when there's a drug or alcohol addiction. Now, labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining of a person for labor or services. So it's through the use, again, of force, fraud, or coercion, like we shared in Kyoki's story, for the purpose of subjection into involuntary servitude, bondage, debt bondage, or even slavery. Labor traffickers often make false promises of a high-paying job, and exciting education or travel opportunities to really lure people into this horrendous epidemic. And so the individuals who are being trafficked find that the reality of their jobs prove to be far different than what was promised. So it's very common where they work long hours, and they also work for little or no pay at all. So individuals that are being trafficked, labor trafficked, may be found in private homes, elder care facilities, factories, farms, ranches, bars, construction sites, hotels, nail salons, strip clubs, and other labor sites. And the list goes on and on. So it does not stay, in one particular list. But this is just to give you an idea of where this may occur. So it should be noted that while labor trafficking may not be as widely recognized or discussed as sex trafficking in Indigenous communities, it does happen. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, the highest number of labor trafficking cases reported with a Native nexus is domestic servitude, which is an individual being forced, coerced, or defrauded into cooking, cleaning, and or caring for another family's children. All right, so our next slide here. Here's a bit more of a breakdown of what human trafficking means. So TVPA of 2000, or Trafficking Victims Protection Act, provides a framework to identify and help individuals who may have experienced trafficking. So as you all know, human trafficking is a crime. The TVPA breaks it into three parts: action, means, and purpose. In a court of law, one of each of these elements needs to be proven for a successful prosecution. The exception is that when minors, anyone under the age of 18, are induced to commercial sex, it is considered human trafficking regardless of the means, as I mentioned earlier. So just to clarify, I want you to understand the legal definition, but I do know it's not necessarily your role to make legal determinations. Anytime a minor, again, anyone under the age of 18 is involved in commercial sex, it is considered human trafficking, regardless of the means used by the trafficker. So in addition to girls, but often overlooked, boys and two-spirit LGBTQI youth are very vulnerable to sex trafficking. Many individuals who experience trafficking, particularly women and children, are exploited for purposes of prostitution and or pornography. However, trafficking also occurs in many types of workplaces, such as domestic work, small businesses, factories, and agricultural work. Traffickers use these three methods to compel adults and children to engage in these activities. So the first we'll look at here is fraud. Fraud involves false promises, as we shared in those case studies, regarding employment, wages, working conditions, or other matters. For example, individuals might travel to another country just with a hope and a promise of something that trafficker painted for them, whether it's modeling, whether it's working at a farm or a factory, only to find out that they were just manipulated into forced labor. Others might reply to advertisement promising a job to be a nanny or service industry jobs overseas, but forced into prostitution once they arrive to their destination. And the second here is coercion. It can involve threats of serious harm to physical restraint against any person, such as threatening to report someone to immigration for deportation or threatening harm to family members and or loved ones. And the third here is force. Force can involve the use of physical restraint or serious physical harm. Physical violence, including rape, beatings, and physical confinement, is often employed as a means to control victims. I'll touch on this a little more in my next coming slides on the difference of domestic violence versus human trafficking. Especially during the early stages of victimization, when the trafficker breaks down the victim's resistance. There's a different purpose in mind, a different intent in that perpetrator's mind, which we'll cover shortly. So at-risk populations. While anyone can be affected by trafficking, this including both US citizens and foreign nationals, there are some populations that are at a higher risk. It may happen, you may encounter these risks at your employment, your place of work. Factors that lead to disproportionate risk factors include a history of abuse and neglect, social disconnection, social stigma and exclusion. Examples of populations that may disproportionately experience these factors and be at a greater risk of trafficking are, as you see here in this chart: refugees, asylees, Native communities, migrant and seasonal workers, disconnected youth, which include unaccompanied minors, youth who have run away or who are experiencing homelessness, Native communities. You can learn more about working with these communities with different resources that I'll share shortly. Another at-risk population: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, intersex, and two-spirit individuals. Individuals with physical, emotional, and or cognitive disabilities, survivors of other crimes. So an at-risk population can include those that have experienced sex assault, rape at any age. They become more at risk to being a victim of sex and or labor trafficking. Using the Centers for Disease Control societal ecological model, this really breaks down risk factors across the dimensions you see shown here. So I had the honor of being I'm one of the graduates, one of the fellows from the Human Trafficking Leadership Academy, which we had the honor of coming up with this model, really identifying Indigenous specific trafficking risk factors. So in our communities, what it looks like and why. We'll show a little picture of our 12 fellows in a bit. So colonialism has really disrupted the life-affirming ways of self-identity and tribal identity of Indigenous people. Different contributing factors heighten individual risk factors, including poverty, mental health stigma, homelessness, inadequate stable support systems, two-spirit, third gender, and Indigenous LGBTQ++ identity, and overall lack of belonging or community. Lack of housing is also a challenge for many Indigenous communities, and it can contribute to an individual's risk of human trafficking among both adults and minors. In some cases, minors are housed by their adult trafficker or abuser. Rental costs, exploitative landlords, and poverty put many people at risk for homelessness, and traffickers exploit these vulnerabilities, especially during these COVID times. This is very common. So the second point here, we'll take a look at a relationship. Assimilation practices have contributed to feelings of disconnect from cultural ceremonies and traditions. The persistence of childhood sex abuse and lack of willingness and ability to address these issues. Tribal communities and Indigenous people that live away from tribal lands and reservations have insufficient services and available support. This lack of resources, it makes it difficult for individuals, families, and communities to heal and address these crimes while further depending distrust and resistance to change. So the third point here is community. It's really important to look at the systematic oppression and influences that make a community susceptible to trafficking. A weak economy and lack of employment and higher educational opportunities, they really cause job insecurity, creating a breeding ground for these crimes to take place. And this is what leaves Indigenous youth open to exploitation. Many young people come to the cities from their tribal communities for many reasons, including promises of love, opportunity, education, safety, and even adventure, and often find themselves extremely vulnerable. And they find themselves in positions for exploitation. Communities for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous often do not recognize or accept trafficking and exploitation as an issue to address, making it harder for survivors to come forward. In many communities, a lack of secure opportunity for victims and survivors creates a thriving environment of opportunity for gang activity and local trafficking. A societal So the societal piece is really important here. It's a demand for buying sex and cheap labor. A demand for buying sex and cheap labor. it really drives human trafficking. Without a demand, there really is no need for a supply. So I'm so glad Special Agent Alani will be sharing more on Operation Keiki Shield and the efforts by law enforcement, because it just goes to show for the demand of young children for the purpose of sex. And so when we are talking about societal, an example of the increased demand for Indigenous women and girls is linked to natural resource extraction, a connection we explore in more depth. We'll discuss that later. But it is important to note, again, that boys and LGBTQIA+ youth are also at risk, despite a tendency in the anti-trafficking field to focus only on women and girls. Now, boys and Two-Spirit, that's a very important factor and part of our Human Trafficking Leadership Academy. There are several fellows that are very passionate about that issue and really go into detail on just being that voice for boys and Two-Spirit populations. So in a federal report studying youth involvement in the sex trade, of the interviewed youth who had experienced trafficking, 36% identified as males and 1% identified as trans male. In that same study, 47% of the interviewed youth trafficking victims identified as bisexual, gay, or a sexual orientation other than heterosexual. So that really shows you the diversity, and that it can happen to anyone, no matter gender. So number 5, historical. Indigenous people throughout the United States, we have been exploited since the very first point of contact with European colonizers. The original mentality of these colonizers that Indigenous people were savages to be tamed continues to influence the world. Influence the views and the treatment of Indigenous people, including hypersexualization of Indigenous women and girls. Methods of trafficking Indigenous women and children specifically has remained consistent across the time through the exploitation of bodies of Native women and girls, and has only remained due to a lack of meaningful intervention. So it's important that we learn this information, because without knowledge, we won't be compelled, or we won't know how to respond. We won't know how to intervene, and we'll go on life thinking that, oh, the next person will do it, or oh, that person with the appropriate title or the degree, they got it under control. But this really breaks down how human trafficking, both sex and labor, it affects everyone. It affects our community. And there's definitely something we can all do about it. So the correlation between missing and murdered Indigenous people, also referred to as missing and murdered Native Americans, and trafficking, can be seen in the many factors that put Indigenous communities at most risk. These risk factors, they impact a person's ability to meet basic needs, including shelter, security, health, and social support. In order for us to proactively protect our communities, we must first take a walk upstream. Let's take a look at some key factors that increase the risk of exploitation. So these include the social determinants of health, such as economic stability, housing and food security, family support, and access to human services. So what are some possible interventions? Well, we can first address the homelessness that exists in Indigenous communities throughout specific funding allocations to tribes, to address housing insecurity on reservations and in urban Indigenous communities, even not part of tribes. Building the capacity in communities to support employment and educational assistance needs to promote economic self-sufficiency. Developing and implementing cultural informed prevention programs designed to support the needs of today's Indigenous youth. Next, providing adequate prevention and intervention programming that addresses substance use and mental health needs and support community healing. Allocating resources to support adequate data collection, correcting misrepresentations, and implementing protocols to provide mechanisms for leveraging data. excuse me. So let's do a knowledge check. I don't like to hear myself talk too much, but so you'll hear me engaging with you. So your chat is like you're communicating with me. So we're gonna do a quick knowledge check here. Which of the following characteristics puts a person at increased risk for sex and labor trafficking? Go ahead and, any of these choices included in the chat. Type your comments in the chat, type your answers in the chat. Again, there's no right or, well, there are right or wrong answers, but you won't be graded. This is really just to engage you and just to really, it's all about learning. So which of these puts a person at risk? Past history of abuse and neglect, disconnection from community, involvement in child welfare and foster care system, and or a history of substance abuse. Which one do you think it is? Very good. I'm looking at your chats here. Any more guesses? Absolutely. All of the above. Very good. All right. So going on here, let's talk about historical trauma. Historical trauma is the cumulative, multi-generational collective experience of emotional and psychological injury in communities and in descendants. When working with and among Indigenous communities, it's vital that we understand and recognize the legacy of colonization, military occupation, separation from parents and families, placement of children in boarding schools or foster care, and other trauma that continues to impact our Indigenous people today. Because of this, it can result in defense mechanisms. As you see here, developmental issues, behavioral issues, depression, anger, among other possible manifestations shown here in this list. It's important to view these behaviors through a trauma-informed lens, recognizing that many issues impacting Indigenous communities and families, it really does stem from historical trauma. And it does not mean these behaviors are acceptable. Just because it was generational, or just because that's how we were taught in our upbringing. And I refer to me and us and our a lot because, of course, I'm part of the Native community and also a survivor of this, but just in case you're wondering. So just because that is what we were taught or how we were raised does not mean it's acceptable. So let's go over the red flags. There are a variety of red flags, which these are going to be indicators of either labor or sex trafficking. So the examples shown here are not, it's not a definitive list. And again, every individual is, they're not going to present the same red flags, but this is just to give you an idea. So when we think about upstream determinants of trafficking, as we spoke of earlier, and how those issues might raise red flags in your workplace, these are some things that we're going to go through. So physical red flags is the first red flag here. What does that look like? Maybe they're untreated or undertreated workplace injuries, bruising and burns, exposure to toxic chemicals, frequent treatment for sexually transmitted diseases, infections, injuries, dental issues, substance abuse, tattoos, burns, branding. So that branding is scarring, which indicates branding. And so those are a few factors of physical red flags. Behavior red flags can be confusing or contradicting stories, inability to focus. Maybe some are unaware of their surrounding, their location, their age, their time. They have no sense of presence, being present. Depression, anxiety disorders, knowledge and behavior outside of typical range for age. For example, if you have a child who is 12 years old, but presents herself maybe a lot older, and those are some behavioral red flags. Next is environmental. Are they accompanied by another person who answers for them, preventing them from speaking freely? That's a lot of control. Are they constantly accompanied by a person who won't leave them alone? In school settings, do their behaviors change? Where, let's say, all of a sudden, they're not coming to school anymore. Or during the pandemic season, maybe they're not coming online as much as they used to. What other significant changes that have occurred? Those are some consider it flags. Are they living at work or living in overcrowded locations? This, I just want to point out for a moment, because culturally, it's very common. I know that here in Hawaii, it's very common for entire families to live in one household. And I'm not talking mom, dad, and their 2 children or 4 children. We're talking aunties and uncles and grandmas and grandpas and generations. But, so don't, there's really fine lines with that. Just because there's multi-generations in one household doesn't mean there's trafficking going on. But I want to make that clear. But that could be an indicator. It could be a red flag, just something to look into. So we're not saying that defines that situation, but these are some things you can kind of pay attention to. Excuse me, for homeless minors and those not living with relatives or foster parents, where are they living? Are they living in a motel? Are they living in a car? Are they very secretive of where they live? So next, the barriers that prevent identification. So the reality is that individuals who are at risk of trafficking or who have experienced trafficking, they're not being recognized. You'll hear a lot of survivors share terms, or they'll make comments that I felt unseen. I felt that no one saw me, meaning maybe there's a lot of individuals, a lot of victims who want help, but they don't know how to reach out for help. They don't know how to, they don't know how to come forth and just share their story. But it starts with being recognized. This is often due to various barriers that hinder identification. So we're going to talk about this. So we're going to talk about 2 barriers: individual related and provider related. A person experiencing trafficking may not self-identify for many reasons. Given the complex jurisdictional challenges faced by many indigenous communities and historic discrepancies in the number of cases that are successfully investigated and federally prosecuted, an individual may distrust the system and fear reporting because they believe nothing will be done. And this for that fact right here is why it's important to partner. Partner with different professionals in the field, different government and non-government agencies that focus on areas that they are good at, and areas that we are not good at, we partner with the rest. But that's how together, in unity, that's how we make a difference, because we bring our expertise, we come together, and we combat this epidemic together. So the history of child removal for boarding schools and child protective services may influence a lack of trust and disclosure as well. They may be fearful from sharing what's happening because maybe they don't want to be taken away or separated from other siblings. So there may be different factors there. A few more for individual related. It lacks awareness of victimization, lacks understanding of victim and legal rights, complicated legal jurisdictions, and all my government workers say amen. There's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of legal jargon, a lot of rules and things happening. So sometimes a victim would rather just shy away from that to avoid all of that, rather than come forward and testify, come forward and share their story. And so with your profession, as attorneys, as law enforcement, as a guardian, whatever your profession is, that is how you alleviate that stress from the individual. More examples, maybe this individual has a language barrier. And this is a big one, fears law enforcement. Another important factor of why partnering with law enforcement is so important. It's not for any other reason but to bring justice and really connect that victim, that individual, with the help that they need for themselves and their family, if that's a healthy situation. Another example of barriers could be, let's see, it's a lack of stability. If it's familial, so if the trafficker is a parent or a relative or a guardian, it does happen. But unfortunately, that could just be another barrier. So that is why, as a teacher, as a member of your community, by us looking and identifying these red flags, we will be the ones to be able to determine, hey, maybe I need to ask more questions. There's cause for concern here with this individual. Maybe it's definitely always going to be worth looking into, because these barriers that this individual feels is what keeps them from coming forward. So any way that we can help is always going to turn out positive. Another example, has this individual experienced trauma bonding with the trafficker and or other victims? In sex trafficking, for example, trauma bonding, there's sexual encounters with these traffickers and with the other victims. They feel they give in to the lie, or that this trafficker loves them, that the trafficker does want the best for them. And that could be a trauma bond. We know it's not the truth. We know that this trafficker only means harm, and their intent is not good. However, for this individual, it doesn't look like that. So let's move on to provider-related barriers. When responding to human trafficking, it is vital that we understand our own limitations, preconceptions, and other barriers that can prevent us from identifying individuals who are at risk or currently living a life of trafficking. One common reason could be a provider may not identify an individual, and that's a lack of knowledge, and a lack of knowledge will only perpetuate negative attitudes about the client, about that individual. There's also well-documented history of Indigenous people experiencing poor treatment from service providers. Unfortunately, according to a poll conducted by NPR, about a quarter of Native Americans have experienced discrimination when going to a doctor or health clinic. It is important to also understand the role of the provider in creating and perpetuating individual-related barriers. So some provider-related barriers, examples of that could be inadequate understanding of federal, state, and tribal human trafficking and jurisdictional laws, fears of violating Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, also known as HIPAA rules, lack of training for medical professionals in identification, lack of training on trauma-informed care, of healing-centered interventions, of culturally sensitive interventions. That's also key. Maybe a provider lacks access to neutral professional interpreters and just kind of checks off the box without seeing the full patient or client situation. That's pretty common as well. Not being so focused on a list of key identifiers, but really trying to get a glimpse of the whole picture, the client or the individual's full situation. Another example, maybe the provider feels that the individual is not responsive, is unresponsive or hostile to questioning or tells a rehearsed story. I think this is important because we never want to get in a routine. And I think that comes easy for a lot of service providers sometimes, that maybe we're just in a routine that we don't see beyond just our checklist. But again, and Special Agent Alani Bankhead will go more into depth with this, which is great. But it's really about just having that, remembering that we're all human. We have our professions, we have these things that we do for a living, but let us not disconnect from our human connection. And that's a big piece. So another common barrier to identification is misconception about the relationship between individuals who have experienced trafficking and the traffickers. It's not uncommon for individuals to be exploited by someone with whom they have a close personal relationship with. Like I mentioned earlier, familial trafficking it does happen also. An example I want to share is a report that was published back in 2008. It found that approximately 14% of individuals who had experienced sex trafficking were recruited by family members. Additionally, almost half identified child trafficking cases in the Counter Trafficking Data Collaborative's international data set, that it began with some family member involvement. And so as you see here in our chart, it really depicts the findings from that counter trafficking data collaborative that I mentioned. It reveals the majority of traffickers in instances of sexual exploitation where someone, the survivor, knows, a family member, intimate partner, or a friend. It's important to highlight the striking difference that in labor and sex trafficking cases. More than 3/4 of individuals who experienced labor trafficking were exploited by someone other than an intimate partner, friend, or family member. Common relationships individuals experiencing trafficking and traffickers can be a romantic partner, a family member, a trusted adult, a gang member, or peer of any age, any gender, ethnicity, or race. So for youth, it may be a relationship through activities such as sports, boy or Girl Scouts, summer jobs. Many youth who recruit are also experiencing trafficking and do not believe they have a choice. Youth also partake in recruiting in detention centers, juvenile detention. That's another issue. All right. You may encounter individuals who have experienced trafficking in many different situations. Labor trafficking involving minors can be especially difficult to identify. It occurs when traffickers manipulate hourly wages and or time needed to complete their work, as well as in cases of debt bondage, when the employee is told that they owe the employer money and have to work off the debt. It is important to note that it is legal in most states for a minor to work, though each state may have varying minimum ages. So minors may experience labor trafficking in a variety of areas. So this includes domestic servitude, in their own home, door-to-door sales, the service industry, including hotels, motels, restaurants, childcare, health and beauty, and agriculture. Here are some examples of locations where you could encounter those who have experienced trafficking. Medical care facilities, powwows, fiestas, or other cultural settings, shipping yards, hotel, tourist attractions, even truck stops. So let's talk about it. Another discussion point. What are some specific at-risk populations in Guam? And if you all can share with me, just type it there in the chat. What are some specific at-risk populations in Guam that you can think of that first comes to your mind? Just go ahead and put it in the chat there. Secondly, what are some places you may encounter someone experiencing trafficking in Guam? So what are some specific at-risk populations, and what are some locations? Where in Guam do you think you can meet someone or encounter someone that may be experiencing trafficking? Go ahead and put it there in the chat. Massage parlors, very good. Yes, absolutely. Massage parlors are definitely common here in Hawaii as well. Construction sites, bars, teens, runaway online, nail salon. Thank you for participating. I appreciate it. All right, so I'm going to move on to my next section. I'm going to talk quicker because our time is just flying by. All right, so next we're going to talk about domestic and sexual violence versus human trafficking. there are many similarities between the two. Human trafficking, power and control wheel, as you see here in my slide, it depicts the methods employed by a trafficker to maintain influence over a victim. This model was adapted from research on domestic violence and highlights shared experiences of domestic violence and trafficking survivors. Domestic violence is all about power and control, where one person might use violence to gain and maintain power over another individual. And so when that violence involves an individual being coerced or manipulated into doing something for another's gain, it is both trafficking and intimate partner violence. Perpetrators of domestic violence and traffickers, they use similar tactics to control victims. That's why I chose to use this power and control wheel, which you may have seen before. An abusive partner may compel someone to engage in commercial sex, forced labor, or involuntary servitude. So someone could be in an abusive relationship. Maybe it involved domestic violence and trafficking was not an element, but maybe it kind of transpired into that. That happens as well. They may promise to address the survivor's needs for love, financial security, or fidelity to keep the survivor under their control. And again, there's other tactics of violence, such as physical and sexual violence, emotional abuse, financial abuse, isolation from friends and family. That can also be used to exploit victims and survivors' vulnerabilities. So what are the intersections? Methods of abuse would be power and control. Power and control exists in domestic and sexual violence as well as trafficking. Victims are subject to physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and economic abuse, as well as isolation. Cycle of violence. Traffickers, like abusers, use cyclical violence to control victims by making promises of love or a better life, by using shame and manipulation. That is very common. Continuum of abuse or push factor. Domestic and sexual violence are often cited as push factors to trafficking. Trafficking by intimate partners and family. Traffickers can be those closest to a victim, including their spouse, intimate partner, or family member, as I mentioned. So what are the differences? What are the differences? The differences is the purpose. Human trafficking, the purpose of human trafficking is exploitation. The purpose of domestic and sexual violence, power and control. So similar, but the difference is the purpose. And of course, you can and will have both. So knowledge check as I endeavor to wrap up here. I hope everyone's awake. Stay with me. This is a lot of information, but I promise you, it will be all worth it. So as we do our knowledge check here, there are many examples of the overlap between domestic and sexual violence and human trafficking. So I just want to test your knowledge really quickly here with this scenario to see if you can depict if it's labor or sex trafficking, domestic violence, or dating violence. Or dating violence. So, and again, please just put your answer in the chat. Feel free to do that at any time. So this is a scenario. An individual is brought to the United States and promised citizenship and marriage, but is instead forced to work and not allowed to leave the home. This is a form of trafficking, of labor trafficking and domestic violence. I just told you the answer. I'm so sorry. Okay, that was a freebie. Let's do one more. The second scenario, a teenager is convicted. I'm sorry, a teenager is convinced to solicit sexual favors for money to pay off their partner's car bill. What is this a form of? Share it in the chat. What do you think? A teenager is convinced to solicit sexual favors for money to pay off their partner's car bill. Very good. Sex trafficking. Very good. This is a form of sex trafficking, and it's also a form of teen dating violence. So an undocumented person is threatened with deportation. I'm sorry, this is the third scenario. An undocumented person is threatened with deportation and physical abuse unless they clean, cook, and caretake without pay for their partner's family. What elements do you think this is? Labor, sex, labor, correct. This is a form of labor, trafficking, and also domestic violence. All right, good job, everyone. Let's move on. So we are coming down to the end of this first piece. I just want to open it up now for any questions that you may have. You can either put it there in the Q&A section or just chat it in the box here. Cynthia, do you know if there were any questions in the Q&A?
What I saw a lot more for those who are really engaged in responding to you in those answers. So much of it are just responses and active participation from those in attendance. So just keeping mindful though and keeping watch, and I'm pretty sure everyone is all anticipating your next questions rather than coming up with theirs.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you went in and out for a second there, but
how about, I just need to work on my connection. Can you hear me okay?
yes.
Okay, so what we'll do is, looks like they were engaged with responding to your questions rather than coming up with theirs. So we'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break from here, and then we'll be able to come through. And so at least this will give Kale time to grab her favorite beverage, which I'm pretty sure you all would be doing now, and taking a quick 10-minute break. And we'll actually come back at, let's just make it half past the hour to make it easier for everyone else. Just wanted to point out though, I'm just looking through the participants list right now. So please, if you were shared a link, we ask too that you also change your name or rename yourself. We've got a couple of those who are sitting in as staff, Dwayne Bass. So if your name is Dwayne Bass, then be able to rename yourself, or else if you are listed as Jicasa FV partner, please also rename yourself. I'm gonna take this break time to check on my audio. So hopefully you'll be able to hear me better the next round. But it's actually Calais that you really need to listen to. So we'll take the 10-minute break now. Thank you.
All right, see you all in 10 minutes. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's back from their break. I just want to go ahead and get things started, if that's okay, Cynthia.
Yes, just want to make sure. I think my microphone is working better, I hope.
A lot better.
Okay, I had to change it. So thanks to my team for having extras on the side. Anyways, just wanted to remind folks that for those of you who are still listed as Jicasa FV partner or as Dwayne Bass, we've got several listed as Dwayne Bass. You probably got the link that he shared just to get you on. Please rename yourself. Otherwise, we won't have record of you being on. So hope you'll be able to rename yourself. If you have any problems with that, message the panelists only, and we'll work with you, or else call our office. Thank you so much. And Calais, it's yours. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So thank you, everyone. I just want to go ahead and jump right in. I went over my time, so I apologize in advance to Alani, but I just want to do a brief introduction. We are just so happy to have her present. She did take time out. She is serving our country right now. She's in the Air Force, but Alani Bankhead, she is a special agent and the alternate commander for the Hawaii Internet Crimes Against Children, ICAC task force, which Alani and I work together at the Hawaii Department of the Attorney General's office, which also covers the U.S. territory. She also covers the U.S. territories of Guam, American Samoa, and CNMI. She is also the handler for K9 Lulu, an electronic detection canine who helps investigators find digital media devices in support of child exploitation cases. Prior to moving to Hawaii, Alani was the International Director of Investigations and Law Enforcement Development at the International Justice Mission, the world's largest anti-slavery organization. In that capacity, she was also responsible for all child sex abuse and sex trafficking cases in Latin America, in the Latin American area of responsibility, including offices in the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Bolivia, and El Salvador. Alani is also a 17-year Air Force veteran where she serves as an Office of Special Investigations and Special Agent. Previous assignments include running informants, targeting Al-Qaeda senior leaders with special operations in Iraq, protecting sensitive technologies from falling into the hands of spies, serving as a senior bodyguard to the Secretary of the Air Force, and investigating felony level criminal offenses. Alani is passionate about protecting vulnerable populations and detests when the strong uses their power to take advantage of the weak, and believes we always can achieve more when we do it together. So with that, I thank you, Alani, for cutting out time to share with us. So please take it away.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. I hope you guys can hear me. I hope you can see my screen as well. Thank you so much, Calais, for the introduction. It's always an honor when your sister in arms asks for some help in co-presenting. It is an honor for me to be here and to engage with you guys today. I did see some folks on the list that we've interacted with before, so it's really great to see you guys again. Hope that you guys have been surviving COVID. And so we're just really excited to share a little bit about what we've been doing out here in Hawaii to combat child exploitation, and just the awesome successes that we've had as a team in working these mission sets. And so for those who aren't familiar with the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, so I'm going to call it ICAC from now on, our job is to investigate technology-facilitated child sex crimes. And so what that means is anything where technology touches sex, we are going to be there. And so we have 5 basic mission sets that we handle. You can see in the orange where it says NCMEC Cyber Tips. So NCMEC is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That is our one legal mandate by law that we are required to cover. So anytime you put in an anonymous request to NCMEC or the various hotlines, it'll end up in Crystal City, Virginia, and then they'll triage them, and the ones pertaining to the Pacific AOR we will get, and then we will triage out to the appropriate police departments. There are millions of tips that come through NCMEC a year. We average about 200 to 300 a month for the entire Pacific AOR. And so again, that is the one mission that we're required to do by law. Everything else, so child sex abuse material is actually the new term for child pornography, and it's the portion in yellow. They changed the terminology fairly recently because, of course, pornography is a legal item. And so associating child pornography with something that's potentially legal, people feel like it kind of convolutes the issue. And so they completely renamed it to make it very clear that there's absolutely nothing legal about child sex abuse material. And so, yes, investigating child sex abuse material crimes using different internet tools. We do those for sure. We also handle commercial sexual exploitation of children, which is the new term for child sex trafficking as well. We do sextortion cases, which is a fairly new term within law enforcement, maybe within the last about 5-10 years or so. But basically the concept is, and I'll illustrate it. So if a minor is online engaging in, just normal communications with folks on the interweb, and let's say somebody kind of asks for a picture that they may feel is slightly inappropriate in taking, right? So let's say if the parent found out about the child taking this picture and sending it, they would probably get in some trouble. So a lot of suspects know that once they have possession of this photo, they can then extort the minor for additional photos or other sexual favors or even money. And so it becomes this like psychological hold where there's this constant cycle of the suspect demanding photos or illegal favors, and then the minor feeling compelled to give in to those demands. And it's a really terrible crime. It really impacts the kids that we interact with. And of course, a lot of times, as Kale mentioned earlier, a lot of people feel like they really can't come forward to law enforcement. And this is especially one of those crimes where that happens because of the concept that the child knows that they are engaging in their own exploitation, right? So they're taking their own photo, and a lot of them feel like, oh, I created the illegal image or, the child sex abuse material. I'm worried I'm going to go to jail. And that's simply not true. And so this is part of why we're out there kind of explaining what it is that we do, especially with this mission set, because it is fairly new. And so if at any point anybody has any questions about it, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then the last one that we handle is also enticement. So enticement is, if you guys remember back in the 90s and the early 2000s, the To Catch a Predator TV show, right, where people would be talking online to various predators and they'd show up at a house and then the host would start asking them why they're there, right? And so the way we utilize that mission set here is through Operation Keiki Shield. And of course, Keiki in Hawaiian means child. And I'll talk a little bit more about our work in that area over the last couple of years. So we handle all of those mission sets for the Department of Justice within the state of Hawaii. But also our job is to fund, train, and equip the other Pacific American territories and Commonwealths. So not only Hawaii, but also Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa as well. And so even though we only have 3 agents, we're very low manned. We had actually intended on doing more engagement out in Guam earlier last year, but unfortunately because of COVID, we weren't able to make it out. But we know that our partners in Guam are doing really incredible work. And so in general, our biggest asset is the ability to resource various departments and agencies that want to work these mission sets. And so having come from the federal side of things where there never is any money, I'm very grateful that at ICAC we are able to provide funding and resources to help enhance investigations for the partners. And so I know it sounds kind of crazy, but if there is equipment that your investigators need specifically for combating child sex exploitation, please do let us know. We do have that on hand. I know we've already sent some of the equipment over to Guam, and so So yeah, that's it as far as our overall ICAC mission. So then as far as Operation Keiki Shield goes, this was a completely joint program that we've been running for about 2 years now. And so federal, state, local, military, law enforcement as well. Hawaii is the only state in the country that has all of the service departments here. So we have a very big military presence. I know you guys have a really big military presence out there as well. And so everybody comes together because of course we know one of the barriers that we have in addressing this issue from the law enforcement perspective is manning and resourcing. And so everybody that we talked to 3 years ago said, we really want to work these cases, but we just don't have the manpower to do it. And so we basically created the concept for Keiki Shield, invited all of the partners to come participate, whether it was one person or 15 people. We invited anybody and everybody to come. We identified the wins, like what a win would look like for that department, and we incorporated it into the operation. And so to date, we've had 52 arrests. As you can see, Keiki Shield 1 was on Oahu. We had 12 arrests for that operation. Keiki Shield has also had 3 military only operations because of various constitutional issues, right? If anybody's familiar with posse comitatus, it was just easier and cleaner to have separate civilian and military operations. And so the very first military operation, we had 10 arrests. The second one, we had 6. And the third one, which we just did a couple of weeks ago, we had 3. And then we've also done 2 operations on Maui. So we had 10 arrests, the first one, which happened right before COVID hit last year. And then we just had another one on Maui last month, and we got 7 arrests from that one. And then we had Kauai as well. So our island was 70,000 people on it. We had 3 arrests on that island, and that was about 1.5 years ago now. And so we're really grateful for the partnership. We could not get these numbers on our own, and not that it's about numbers, right? It's about achieving justice on behalf of our kids and our communities. But this is truly, like, any success that comes from this is because it's a partnership, a complete and total partnership. And so as far as the results that have come out of the arrest numbers themselves, so today we've had 23 convictions or plea deals at a rate of 93% conviction. And so this is incredible from a law enforcement standpoint. It is very rare to get this level of conviction with most other mission sets. Actually, the one guy that kind of got away was an Army soldier who had a date of separation within weeks of being arrested. And the legal office just decided to let him separate and not prosecute. And so while we don't agree with it, he's still on the books as having been arrested for this offense, and that'll follow him for the rest of his life. For each jurisdiction that we've worked with, so the feds are by far the biggest legal hammer. They have a mandatory minimum 10-year sentence, and so all of their cases have been garnering between 10 and 15 years in prison, as well as sex offender registry. They actually are running 100% conviction rate on the federal side. So kudos to our FBI and HSI partners for all their amazing follow-up work, including a prior sex offender as well. They're also running the more egregious personas, so more on the trafficking side. And then we also have our military partners. So they actually have the most flexible hammer. So especially if we're arresting a service member, there is no such thing as double jeopardy, right? So the Constitution says that you have right to a speedy trial and you cannot be tried twice for the same crime. And so with the military and the UCMJ, it's a completely separate offense. So they are more than happy to come alongside and hold these people accountable, because as service members, they have a higher responsibility to integrity and ensuring that they are serving their communities as they should be and not exploiting our kids. And so we're very, very grateful for the military. They've actually really been the tip of the spear. They have the bulk of the arrests, not because of, like the bulk of our suspects are military. They've just been very aggressive in wanting to constantly put these operations on, because they don't want these guys in the service. They want them identified. And then any potential victims that these kids might have, any potential victims that the suspects might have, they want them identified so that those minors can receive services. The Attorney General's office also has a number of cases pending. However, it just takes a little bit longer in the legal system here at the state. And so we're hoping and keeping our fingers crossed that we're going to have successful adjudication on those. But the numbers are looking pretty good so far. And so yeah, as far as adjudication goes on the military side, we're looking at 3 to 6 years on average, dishonorable discharge, as well as sex offender registry across the board. So one of the common misconceptions that we hear is a child predator, it has a certain look, right? Like old, gross guy living in his mom's basement, no friends kind of thing. The truth is actually that most of these suspects are your neighbors. They are business professionals. They are cops. They are youth pastors. And when we ran the numbers on the arrests that we've gotten so far, it's upwards of 63% have no prior record. And when I say no prior record, I mean there's no speeding ticket, nothing. And so what this tells us is that most of these guys actually operate completely under the radar, never being caught. To that point, through the operation, we've also identified about 19 children that have been previously abused by the suspects that we've arrested. And to be honest, the initial, if you guys remember To Catch a Predator, they'll always ask, well, what are you doing here? And they'll always say something like, oh, I just wanted to check on the kid and make sure that they were okay. And we all know that's a bunch of garbage. And so it's through the investigative process that investigators have been able to determine that no, there was prior abuse. And most of these suspects actually do admit to having prior touching incidents with kids. And so that really initiates a follow-on investigative process for us to try to find those kids to get them the services that they need. So again, this is your neighbor. This is the average person. There's no particular look for a child predator. And so please be vigilant with your kids on kind of some of those predisposed ideas. The fastest arrest we've actually had on Operation Keiki Shield was about 20 minutes. And when I say 20 minutes, I mean from when the chat initiated, so somebody said hi, to when enough evidence was gathered that we knew we could successfully prosecute. A lawyer reviewed all of the evidence and agreed that there was enough to prosecute. The suspect got in their car and drove over to us, and there was handcuffs on their hands. It took about 20 minutes. And so that actually personally for me is alarming because there really has been a shift in the last about 10 years or so on these types of cases to where, not in the beginning of the crime set, but when I first started working these cases almost 13 years ago, suspects knew there was a lot at risk. They knew that they were, possibly talking to law enforcement and did a lot of work trying to vet us to make sure that we were who we said we were. And now they're operating with complete freedom, and they're not scared to do what they do. Most of them don't even bother to check anymore. And that to us signals that they do this quite frequently. And so that's some of the data that we've been seeing around just the 52 arrests that we've seen. So one of the things that we hear a lot here out in Hawaii is that this crime does not happen here, right? So child sex exploitation, child enticement. Our very first arrest from the very first Keiki Shield was actually this retired HPD officer, Honolulu Police Department, Officer Goaz. He was attempting to have sex with a 13-year-old boy. And at the time that he was arrested, he literally told the officers, I wondered when I'd be caught. And so again, like this establishes that there's a pattern with most of these guys of perpetual abuse of these minors. And we know that we don't catch all of them, but we have to do everything that we can to get them off the streets. Something else that I hear a lot of that also is not supported by the data from these operations is that it's all tourists, it's all visitors. When in reality, the numbers here show that we've only arrested one tourist. That was on Maui last month. Otherwise, all of the suspects have been locals or native to the islands. And so here we have, just as an example, Keiki Shield 6 on Maui, which again was last month. So we arrested 7 suspects during this operation. So Kiefer Fu right here in the bottom right is our tourist. And part of why we want to highlight Maui as well is because the work that is happening at a joint level, and we truly do believe that this is because of the collaborative efforts on the federal, state, local, and military side, there are ripple effects in the community with these cases. So you'll notice David Abiola, as a result of the operation and the press that it got, 4 more victims actually came forward within about a week of the operation being completed. And for us, I mean, that is so wild. And to be honest, I do believe that there are more than 4 victims out there. But the impact that we have on a joint level in seeking justice for these prior victims is really what kind of does it for us, as far as like, I mean, this is why we do it, right? Is to serve our communities and make sure that people are being held accountable for the crimes that they commit. And in fact, we do monitor social media on these operations. And literally the same day that the news story dropped, there were people posting about it, that David Abiola had been raping women for years since he was in high school. They finally got him, this woman says. Thank God. I'm sure there are several girls feeling some relief. And there was another comment. Thank you, Maui PD, from those of us who you couldn't protect when we were kids. Thanks for stepping up for kids now. And so, I mean, this is heartbreaking and, insanely gratifying for us, because we know that there are kids being abused out there. The statistics from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children show that it's about 1 in 4 girls and about 1 in 9 boys are sexually exploited. And so we never want to feel like these kids are alone. So we hope that through efforts with the press and through these investigations, that people know that we're out there looking for these kids, trying to remove them from unsafe, dangerous, exploitative situations so that they can keep being kids and start their healing journey, so that they can be whole, healthy adults as they continue on in their lives. And so we're very grateful for the joint model. It has just worked wonders, and it's only because of the humility of the partners that we've been able to achieve that with Keiki Shield. One of the other things we hear a lot is human trafficking definitely does not happen here in Hawaii. That's just not true, right? So one of the suspects on Keiki Shield 1, actually, he had solicited one of the law enforcement officers to exchange an economic instrument for sex with a child, and in fact, a 5-year-old. And through the course of the chat operation, he had asked the law enforcement officer, does the child ever wear nails? And so he'd asked specifically about these pointy nails that are like all the rage right now. And the reason why was because he was really big into sadomasochistic behavior with little kids. And so he graphically talked about the child digging their nails, their pointy nails, into the law enforcement or the suspect's body, and things that he would do to the child as well. So these aren't just like, people who kind of fall into this crime set. These are very developed predators. And we're very grateful that we were able to arrest him so that we could get him off the street so he could stop being a threat to the community. But this is one example of one of the types of chats our officers have from operation to operation. The suspect himself, just to show what a great human being he is, he actually almost left his wife while she was in the middle of labor with their child. He ended up showing up the next day, so I'm grateful he stuck around for the birth of his child, except that the day he was arrested turned out to be the day before his kid's birthday. So yeah, these people are, the psychology of it all, like, they're very distorted, very twisted people. And again, we're very grateful. This case actually ended up going federal, and we're really grateful for that big hammer to send a message to the community that we take these crimes very seriously, and that we're not going to tolerate it. So, going back to kind of bigger picture though, like, why does Keiki Shield work? I went back and I ran the numbers, and within the state of Hawaii, and this is at the federal, state, local, military, law enforcement level, we only have about 12 dedicated child sex abuse investigators. And so with such few investigators dedicated to this mission, we absolutely have to collaborate. And so being able to come together every so often, everybody just surges for a very short period of time, and then we can get those results, has been incredibly satisfying for us. And then also, of course, we love the kids, right? There's absolutely no room for ego in this mission set. And to be honest, we found that when the ego does show up, things typically don't go that well, because in order to support these kids and to help them start their journey to overcome their trauma, you just have to love them. You just have to bring love into it. And the other thing too is burnout mitigation. I've worked drugs, I've worked counterterrorism, I've worked counterintelligence, I've worked personal protection. I've worked a lot of different mission sets. This is kind of the one special one where if we can get an investigator in that mission for a couple of years, that's a massive win, but you're in the slimy pits of humanity with this mission set. And so, so being able to come together and support each other has been massively beneficial, and helpful in us sharpening each other and just keeping each other accountable and just ready to go, working the mission. So we've been doing Operation Cookie Shield for the last 2 years, and then we recently expanded to an operation we called Shine the Light. And so that one actually started last October. We've had 2 iterations of it. This one is focused on the recovery of missing youth and runaways. And so we actually saw a gaping hole with our missing youth and runaways, especially with the foster kids, because of course, as Kale was saying, we know that they're at higher risk of being trafficked, higher risk for any type of exploitation and abuse, not to mention the reasons why they became foster kids to begin with. And we really felt like, especially with the number of kids that were rerunning, we needed to do something to let them know that this isn't just about law enforcement making a case or getting a bean or anything like that. We need to focus on how we can better serve our communities so that, again, we can have these healthy adults introduced into society. And so over those 2 operations, we facilitated 7 recoveries. 5 of the kids were actually confirmed CSEC or assessed for CSEC. And so even with the 2 that were assessed for CSEC, all that means is our aftercare service providers, who were amazing, went in and did their magic with them, but there was no proof that they could identify that child had been a victim of sex trafficking, but we're pretty positive that they were. And so for us, this operation really is at the nexus of technology, runaway missing kids, and the trafficking piece. So it's a very small part of our mission set, but anything that we can do to support in this way are foster kids, because they're just often so forgotten, we will do that. And so actually one of these kids, we found her while she was overdosing in a homeless encampment. So it's pretty wild for the investigators to know and believe that they walked away that day knowing that they saved someone's life. And actually one of the minors that we recovered was a foster child from Guam who had been missing for about 10 months, I believe. And so being able to be that tool to get her back home so that she could reconnect with her family back in Guam was hugely satisfying as well. Also, kudos to our Missing Child Center Hawaii. So Kalelani and her coworker Amanda as well. There were so many entities between them and child welfare services here in Hawaii that really had to fight a fight with the bureaucracy here in order to ensure that the best interests of the child were served. And so we're really grateful for these partnerships, and they're really difficult sometimes to execute, but you know, all we can do is what we can do today, and we're just super grateful for just continuing to be, you know, better every day. And so again, how this ties into law enforcement, right? So child sex trafficking victims are arrested a lot of times, right? They've had multiple run-ins with law enforcement officers. Traffickers manipulate them into criminal activity. A lot of them have drug use. And so there's this crazy cycle of like contact with law enforcement not being positive. It's a very negative experience for them. And so for us moving forward, you know, this is the kind of data that we provide to our officers on the ground when we're briefing them, because this isn't just about the investigation. The investigation is very important, but going back to that victim-centered approach of, you know, this is about what's in the best interest of the victim for their healing journey. And so Kale's counterpart, Amanda from the Missing Child Center, had actually shared this email with us from June of last year from a survivor who had been trafficked between the ages of 13 to 18. And she had been recovered 10 years ago by a Honolulu police officer. And, you know, 10 years have gone by, and she, you know, in that moment decided she wanted to reach out and say, I don't know where this officer is, but if you can find him, let him know, please. Thank you so much. And I'm doing well, and I have a family, and I'm clean. And all of that starts with one contact with law enforcement, right? And I bet Officer Kahawai doesn't know the impact that he had on Ashley, but this is like the core of what it is that we do. And so again, having our investigators focus on the bigger picture of, you know, day to day, like these kids are combative, they're spitting at us, they're fighting us, they're running away from us, right? But we just have to believe that day to day, we might be planting a seed, we might be you know, watering it, fertilizing it. But we know that on average, based on studies, it takes about 7 contacts for law enforcement to start building trust with victims. And so whether it's contact 1 or contact 7, we really hope that through our community engagement, they learn that we're not going to give up on these kids. And so I know Kale already kind of touched on trauma-informed care. This is the model that we are trying to pivot towards. So again, giving control back to the victim, minimizing any trouble they might be. We say all the time that our job is not to put handcuffs on victims or get them in trouble. It doesn't matter what crimes they've committed in the past. The point being that it's all about them and their healing journey and just supporting them. Yeah. And again, you know, the real goal, which again, investigations are definitely a part of what we do, and we have an obligation to that and seek justice and hold perpetrators accountable, but also, you know, for law enforcement to be a tool in that healing process and just care about our communities. That's where it really all begins for us. And so pivoting to Lulu, so K9 Lulu is our electronic detection canine. She's the only electronic detection canine in the state of Hawaii. There are only 53 of these in the country now. And so her job is to find digital media. So for the child sex abuse material investigations, right? So former child pornography cases. She's a black lab and she's actually dual purpose. So when we go on search warrants, she'll help us find anything from a laptop to a cell phone, micro SD cards that are super teeny tiny. You can see the photo near the top of the screen there. And she's also a comfort dog for abused kids. So she knows about 50 different commands. She will high five the kids. She'll give them hugs. She'll take their socks off. She'll give them DAP, right? She's just been such a great resource for us to build relationships, not only with the survivors, but also with the community as well. Her hobbies include stand-up paddleboarding and eating musu bees. So that's her post arrest warrant treat is musu bees. And we're very grateful to have her. She's just been a real joy. And actually because of her, we've had a few instances where people have reported abuse to her. And actually the format in which they did that was through her Instagram page. And so if you guys are interested, she does have an IG page. It's k9.lulu. And so we kind of came up with this concept to wedge internet safety tips for parents and for kids in between cute dog pictures. And so you can follow Lulu's adventures. You can see updated news and information on our operations. Post-operation, we try to do a recap in case you guys want to follow it. And I did forget to mention, so hidden in plain sight, we did a search warrant last week actually where as you guys know, you can hide digital devices basically anywhere. And so the team had already gone through and done an initial search. Lulu indicated on this bin, and we found a USB embedded into a bracelet. And so you can see her, she's so proud of herself when she finds stuff. She just wants to get paid with her musu bee. But yeah, so that's why we have those dogs. And also one of the reasons why we wanted to highlight her to you guys is these dogs are actually completely free to law enforcement. So the company that creates them also has nonprofits that donate money to pay for the dogs so that law enforcement does not have the financial burden of training the dogs. It's about $13,000 to $15,000 for a dog. So if there is a local unit that is interested in getting one of these dogs, please contact me and I will be super happy to put you in contact with Todd. He's amazing to work with, super easy to work with. But in the meantime, if we're around Guam and you guys see us, please don't hesitate to say hi. Lulu is the sweetest girl. She's not aggressive in any way, shape, or form. And I'm so sorry to wrap up so quickly, but that's it for me as far as the presentation goes. So again, you know, we had hoped to partner with our Guam partners out there last year. We'll see what happens with COVID this year. But we are aware of some of the work that they've been doing, and we're just so grateful for all of their efforts. They're a super awesome team and very, very easy to work with. And so we're really excited for Team Guam and everything that they're trying to do out there. So, but that's it for me. So thank you guys so much for the opportunity to come chat with you for a little bit. And I can stick around maybe for a couple of questions, but beyond that, I'm so sorry I have to go, but. So.
Thank you again so much, Alani. Like I mentioned, if you have questions, please go ahead and share them in the chat or the Q&A section. I just want to take this time to again thank you to Alani. She is serving right now our Air Force, in the Air Force. So we just want to thank her for taking the time. Does anyone have any questions? If not, we can always forward it on to her later, but I don't want to keep her. So let's just all thank Alani. And Alani, of course, thank you again, but you're welcome to go. I know you have to run. Thank you so much. All right, so I'll just dive right in. I'm sorry, folks. I know we're behind on time. So I'll just go ahead and continue the rest of our webinar here. All right, if I can get this going. All right. Okay, so to continue on human trafficking, now at the last point, I'm going to talk about how to identify, screen, and respond to human trafficking. So that was a great special ad for Alani to share with us. As you heard, it's just all this knowledge, everything that we're learning is so important, but it's really nothing without action. And so to partner up with such incredible agencies, especially our law enforcement, we truly, truly appreciate them for all their sacrifices. And of course, as you see, there's been great success because of it. So I'm just so thankful for them. So going on, I just want to touch on your role when others inquire, or your role, I'm sorry, in inquiring about trafficking. So it's important to always, as we talked about earlier, some red flags. Maybe you come across an individual that shows some signs that they could be victims of trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking. How do you then respond? How do you then inquire? And that's what we're going to talk about. So creating a safe environment is crucial. It's about building rapport. It's such a foundational element of trauma-informed care. There are several practical ways to enhance an individual's feeling of safety and security when inquiring about trafficking. For example, in some indigenous cultures, as you may know, it is customary to offer traditional therapeutic medicines such as sage, cedar, or sweetgrass, or other supplies that supports the individual in grounding to center, purify, just encourage their beliefs. It empowers them. Therefore, it would allow them to feel like they can share with you and can hold space to be able to share information that's so private. And so that's one way to kind of speak more with the individual that you believe may be experiencing trafficking. Lessons learned from intimate partner violence screening tools that have been used for over 15 years have shown that how you ask questions is also important in determining how much information the individual shares. So looking at this slide, these are some examples of common mistakes. Do you think the healthcare provider realized in this situation, it was a healthcare provider, do you think they realized that they were asking in a way that encouraged the individual to say no? go ahead and read these questions and, you know, kind of try to visualize this happening. So questions like this: no one is hurting you at home, right? Or are you safe? Are you safe at home? It typically doesn't result in a disclosure rate. But they are commonly used questions used by different service providers. So these are some questions that we want to avoid. Now, these are some alternatives. Here are some solutions for you. These are better ways to deliver and frame a question. Open with a framing statement while making eye contact, such as, we've started talking to all of our patients about safety and healthy relationships because it can impact your health. Then begin going over confidentiality and the limits to confidentiality. You always want to begin your discussion with a sample as part of your screening tool to help them feel comfortable. And again, you know, we provide this information, but please understand every situation is different. So if the individual or the patient comes in and they're not mentally stable, or they're high, intoxicated, this framework or any framework is not going to be successful, right? And so this is framed specifically for individuals who are sober and pretty stable individuals in that moment. So these are some positive alternatives for you. So when meeting with an individual who might be experiencing or have experienced trafficking, it is important to first create a setting that supports the person. It's a trauma-informed approach, and that's what we want to be sensitive for. Again, this is for any setting. So whether you're in a classroom, I'm going to speak about healthcare providers a lot, but you know, this is just to help you focus on the individual and remind yourself to, you know, it is all about the individual. When you're asking questions, you just want to create a safe space for them. And then another important factor is you want to be sure to let the individual know the purpose of your questions. A lot of individuals that have been victimized, whether it's trafficking or sex abuse, they have gone through a lot of questions, whether it's by law enforcement, counseling, doctors, healthcare providers. They've been through, especially foster care youth. And so by communicating the purpose of your questions, sometimes that would help in providing information about the process. So it would help equip them, prepare them to know what to expect, because there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of things going on. And also it's important to convey to them the potential, how you might be using the information that they do provide. So you don't want to tell them false information. You want to tell them, if you're a mandated reporter, it's important to let them know that up front. And so they don't feel betrayed later when you tell them that you have to report the information that you just shared. So next, simply asking questions is not enough to elicit information. You, as a provider or just an individual in your community, you have to prioritize the individual's sense of safety and well-being. That is number one. You might or you do want to minimize the need for them to retell their story. Having an individual, a victim who has already experienced such trauma, the last thing you want to do is have them continue to repeat and relive that trauma. The goal is not disclosure. So the goal in working with individuals who have gone through and experienced such trauma, the goal is not to have them disclose or confess per se of what had happened. The goal is to understand their circumstances and connect with them. And really, it's about being human at the end of the day. And I just want to note here, I'm not going to go into the trauma-informed approach. This is really what we're going to delve into in our webinar in May. So briefly, here are some different ways to determine the needs of someone who may be at risk of trafficking, or is currently a victim of trafficking. Let's see. So here on this slide, universal education. Even if a client does not disclose maybe that they are being trafficked or have been trafficked, staff should always offer resources in case something like the experiences described do occur for them. So if there are red flags that come up and there are concerns, but the individual does not disclose, it's always best to still provide them with resources rather than them walk away or you part ways and they not have those resources should they need them. So you always want to provide that. So next here, let's see, screening. So screening. As a provider or individual, you should always be aware of the setting and population with which the tool was tested or validated. So your goal for screening is going to be identify risks, provide appropriate interventions, and kind of go through the scenario with them, or as I shared earlier, different flags to monitor. And then also the follow-up. If it is confirmed that they have been trafficked or are going through that, what is the aftercare? What resources in your community can you connect them to? So really briefly, kNOw and pair tool. kNOw here, I won't read through it, but as you can see, it stands for confidentiality. UE represents universal education and empowerment and support, which are critical tools that everyone should know about when speaking with patients that have, or individuals that have lived through or are living through trauma, any traumatic experience. So the PAIR tool, it builds on the kNOw intervention, and it was created by Dignity Health in partnership with Heal Trafficking and Pacific Survivor Center. So this is another example of a universal approach tool applied in a national nonprofit healthcare system. So this acronym is as follows, as you see there, and it's just such an important tool, something that acronyms are always helpful. So for here, privacy, it's a great reminder, discuss sensitive topics alone and always in a safe private setting. Education, educate each individual in a manner that is non-judgmental and normalizes sharing information, whether it's via a brochure or a safety card. Allow time for discussion with the individual. Limit questions to only those needed to determine if that person is safe, or connect them to resources. Always respect the individual's wishes, even if you feel you have an inkling that they are victims. If they are choosing not to share at that time, respect their wishes. Even if they deny victimization or decline assistance, respect their wishes. Next, respond. Respond with a person-centered approach in which the individual's input is actively sought and prioritized. So think about the person. In all that we do, it's about that individual that's before us. Next, there are general screening tools for cross-discipline professionals, as you see here. I know there was a question earlier that asked for resources on how to provide for youth in your community, on key identifiers and what to look for. So all of this information are programs that NITAC provides. So we will share this with Cynthia and her team to pass along if you are interested in accessing this information. Engaging with youth. So many considerations for engaging with youth are similar to engaging with adults. It's always important to enhance feelings of safety, security, and use trauma-informed approach. You do, however, want to remember these points when you are dealing with youth. It's because they're children, so we want to remember, avoid being formal, sometimes it's intimidating for them. Start by introducing yourself. A lot of these considerations are very human-based, right? Again, sometimes we get caught in the position or the title of our expertise, and we forget about that human connection, which is vital in all of this. Inform the child that you are a mandated reporter. You want to let them know up front so that one, they can know that they can trust you, and you're an official, not that they're just telling another adult that has maybe lost their trust in the past. Next, focus on the conversation that they're choosing to talk about. Speak with them about prevention. Speak with them that make it inclusive of their friends and loved ones, so they don't feel like all the attention is on them. A lot of situations, individuals will immediately open up when you talk about how it can impact their family and friends. Maybe they don't want to share about themselves right away, but when you include family and friends, I even thought of maybe what they've gone through or that situation happening to loved ones will just really change their heart on what's being discussed. So that might help as well. Help them identify people of trust in their life, reiterating that key law enforcement, key healthcare providers, key teachers can be trusted adults, and it's okay. It's okay to share with them, because we always want to remember that there have been adults, clearly, if they are victims of sex abuse, rape, or even trafficking, they lost trust in adults because those adults were those perpetrators that did those bad things to them. And finally, use a strength-based approach by focusing on their strengths focus on resources, focus on their skills, their talents, and different relationships that they can have. All right, another engaging opportunity. Go ahead and type your answer in the chat quickly. What are some needs of individuals who have experienced trafficking? Go ahead and type your letter. Is it medical care, mental health care, transportation to appointments, connection to culture, legal aid, or all of the above? E, absolutely, all of the above. That was an easy one. All right, we are winding down on time, and what I'm going to do, Cynthia, I'm going to kind of fast forward here. All right, I'm going to fast forward here really quickly. All right. So in all of this, you know, what's the point of everything that I shared? It's really, there's different approaches, different techniques that you can provide to these individuals that have experienced such, I mean, you can't even imagine the horror that they've experienced. And at the end of the day, when that victim turns from victim to victor, from victim to survivor, that's when it's time for resiliency. That's when you want to begin to provide empowerment and continue to still help them every step of the way. Different things that you could do is connect that victim with key resources in the community, connect that survivor with, depending on what level they are in their healing, connect them with key organizations in your community. This is our Human Trafficking Leadership Academy Fellowship that I spoke on earlier. This is our fellows group right here. And we get together as professionals, yes, survivors, but we're at a stage in life where we are more than just we are more than just survivors. We're thriving in life, and we're choosing to now give back, choosing to be a part of a solution, choosing to not just rehearse and speak about our story, but provide insight, provide clarity, provide just, we can provide and contribute so much more to the efforts to combat this epidemic and to help victims and survivors. And so that's what we are about doing. So being a part of not only statewide efforts, but also efforts nationwide and even globally, it's always an honor to be able to do so. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to skim through this information. But these are the kinds of discussions that's important. Now, this was a lot of information today. So I know you're on information overload. I just want to thank you for your time. I know several of you asked in the chat about more resources, where you can find this. So NITAC does provide different programs. We do have that information in our slides, as well as different links. So we'll share that with Cynthia if she does not already have it. And then hopefully her and her team can share it with you, or post it somewhere that it could be accessed. But at this time, I'll go ahead. I'm sorry that we had to kind of wrap things up, but I hope that we could allow more time for our 2-day webinar in May about trauma-informed care. So if you have any questions at this time, I would definitely welcome you to ask them now, and then I'll go ahead and turn it over to Cynthia.
Thanks so much, Calais. And you know, this is the usual. We start talking about an important issue. we get so into it and then time just creeps up on us. But
Right.
fortunately for us, we do have May, May 19 and May 20. And if you've registered for today, you will automatically get that link. So be sure to look for it. And if you had to call in so we could bring you in online, please register for that. And it's been posted on the chat also, or else check out our website and we've got that. Again, just a reminder, we will have materials available on our login page. And that is, of course, on our website, www.guamcoalition.org. And as we noted a moment ago, and I'll have the team also post that. Click on the blue login button. Please post that too so that they'll be able to access the information as well. So we appreciate everyone, and post your questions in the chat or send that to us on email info@guamcoalition.org, and we'll be able to get your questions to Calais if that hasn't been answered. And I know there's a pending question in the Q&A for someone who actually directed the question to Alani. And so we'll be able to connect with her and ask if there's any possibility of expanding the resource, of course, to the FSM. Certainly, we are concerned about human trafficking. It's not just on our island. It's not just in Hawaii. It is certainly here in the Pacific. And so we do thank Calais for joining us today. And of course, kudos also to the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. I'm going to do a shout out to Jenna Novak for working with us to schedule Calais and Alani also to provide this training. So folks, in the interest of time, we are out of it. So we just want to thank you. And Calais, thank you again. And we will be sure to get to the case studies the next session that we're going to be on. And again, just a reminder, CLEs we are able to offer, but because of the total number of contact hours, we are not able to offer even one CEU. So perhaps this will only mean that then the next time around will ask for more time from Calais, since she does have a tons of information to share. So thank you all again, and we'll see you May 19 and May 20, same time, and you'll have a different Zoom link. So look out for that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Aloha.